Implications of brain injuries on learning. Brain injuries can have effects on learning and behavior. There are many ways a brain injury can occur, such as car accidents, falls, and a very common one is from sports. So concussions are a common brain injury that can happen from sports. And unfortunately, if an individual has multiple concussions, their learning and memory can be permanently affected. The brain's plasticity declines with age. Plasticity is the brain's ability to compensate when there is a damage to a certain area. Depression and problem sleeping are also associated with traumatic brain injuries. Depending on where the injury was to the brain, certain functions can be affected as well. For example, the frontal lobe is damaged and the individual has trouble with decision making and problem solving. The next slide is about the brain and autism. Autism is a neurological disorder that severely affects a child's development. Symptoms include difficulties with language and social interactions, problems interacting with others, communicating and maintaining socially appropriate behaviors, and difficulty interpreting emotions and facial expressions. Autism is a heritable disorder and there are structural differences in the brain. So when they first observe it, it appears that they have abnormally large brain volume in the white cerebellar matter and a large cortical gray matter, but over the years, as they continue the study, this decreases, so it ends up that they have smaller brain volume in those areas. The next slide is about the brain and ADHD. So ADHD is linked to environmental factors rather than being linked to genetics like autism was. ADHD symptoms are caused by the brain inconsistently processing sensory input. Sometimes messages are sent normally, but other times the messages are not processed in the typical organized way. So this causes the individual to act disorganized and it affects their ability to focus. Some studies have shown that structures in the brains of those with ADHD function differently than they typically would, and the brain processes things in a unique way. Another factor that contributes to ADHD is the fact that those with ADHD tend to have more excitatory chemicals in their brain. So this is why it is like a hyperactive disorder. A study showed that it is easier for those with ADHD to focus on digital media such as computer or video games. So this is like a helpful thing to know if you're a teacher with students that have this disorder. The next thing is biochemical influences on learning. So the use of medications for individuals with disorders such as ADHD and Tourette's has been proven extremely beneficial, and it decreases the undesirable behaviors and increases their performances in school. Irregularities in the balance of biochemicals in the body can be influenced by many factors. So stimulants such as sugar, coffee, and other things with caffeine, and pharmaceuticals such as like different medications can affect the speed that information is processed by the brain. The next slide is about research on memory. So learning is done by attending to stimuli, encoding information about the stimuli, integrating and storing data in the memory, and then being able to retrieve that data as needed. So those with a learning disability have trouble with one or more of those things. Studies have proven that multiple things can make the classroom environment better for all students. So quieter classrooms are beneficial since it decreases distractions. So sometimes like a teacher will put on like white noise in the background or like some quiet music because it'll distract from the other noises. And then using visual supports along with auditory to help students commit information to their long-term memory. And also giving students more practice will help them retain that information. The next one is about metacognition. So this is the knowledge and control that individuals have over their own thinking and learning. It's an abstract process, so it's difficult for those under the age of 7, and it should be taught over time to allow students to gain the skills necessary to learn new information or processes. So students can be taught to make predictions, like this is like the first step that can be taught even in like younger age students, and this helps to focus their attention. Next, they can learn to visualize and verbalize. This helps them understand the meaning of what they are reading. And teaching them to take good notes is helpful to the students because it can help them retain information because they're using multiple methods. So if they're like listening to the teacher talk as well as writing it down, that can be helpful to them. And they can keep their notes to review the information at a later time. So there are several methods that can be used with taking notes, and you should go over these with your students, such as mapping or graphic organizers, use of mnemonic devices, and verbal self-mediation. So the next slide I have is the timeline of laws for learning disabilities. So the first one we have is in 1975, it's the Education of All Handicapped Children, which entitled all children to a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment, including those with disabilities, as well as protecting the rights of children with disabilities. The next one is in 1973. This is the Civil Rights Act, which we have Section 504. And this prevents discrimination against those with disabilities in programs that receive less federal funding. This doesn't require parental consent, and there is less specific criteria to receive these services than there is with our next one, which is IDEA, which was originally in 1990, but then it was reworked in 2000. So this was designed to provide government services for individuals with disabilities in the field of education. It requires an IEP and parental consent, as well as they must fit the criteria. This act is enforced by the U.S. Department of Education. Then our last one is in 2000. This was the No Child Left Behind Act, and it keeps schools accountable, and they must keep up on submitting student progress reports. So schools must submit a yearly report that is available to the public, and funding can be revoked based on the school progress. Our next slide is about parental rights in the law. So parents have the right to be given a copy of their rights. Their rights include that their children's records must be kept confidential. They can review and inspect the records and have copies of all the records, as well as any documentation that regards their child. They can release records if they obtain permission from the school in writing. They must be notified in advance of any meeting that pertains to their child. They can request an assessment of their child, then request an independent one if they do not agree with the district's results. And then they can have input with their child's IEP, as well as refusing special education services. They can also request a hearing if there are disagreements in regards to their child's placement or services. So then our next thing is about parents as advocates. So a lot of times, like parents with a new child, they may not understand what it means to be an advocate for their child. So there are actually many online resources that they can use to learn how to become an advocate for their own child. So there's one on the Learning Disabilities Association website, as well as Reading Rockets and Rights Law. And there are also many books available on the topic. The next one is about students' rights. So the student has the right to due process. They can be heard in defending themselves, and they're allowed access of all documents regarding their charges. They have the right to be treated with respect and courtesy, and they have the right to a prompt hearing, a safe learning environment, a free and appropriate education, and accommodations for their learning disabilities. So our next one is the differences between Section 504 and IDEA. So Section 504 is a civil rights law, while IDEA is an education act to provide students with services. So IDEA protects those from ages 3 to 21, while 504 protects people of all ages. They both provide free and appropriate public education, but IDEA provides funding to implement those services, and 504 does not. So this slide is about teachers' rights and their obligations. So teachers have the right to be treated with respect by their students, work in a safe environment, and be able to teach. But they also have the obligation to notify parents before beginning evaluations to set up an IEP, and they also have the obligation to follow the guidelines that are set in the IEP. So this is about the purpose of behavior intervention plans. The purpose of behavior intervention plans is to address significant problems a student is having and come up with ways to help that student. This plan is legally binding once it's signed by the parent and can keep the school from being held responsible for a student's behaviors. This is a student's right in regards to suspension and expulsion. So, a student can only be suspended up to 10 days in 1 year. Before the 11th day a student is suspended, an IEP team must review the student's behavioral plan to ensure it is still appropriate and effective. If not, it will need to be reworked. Before a student is expelled, there must be a pre-expulsion meeting of the IEP team. The student may need a functional behavior assessment to determine whether there is a link between their behavior and the disability. But when the behavior problem involves a serious thing such as drugs or weapons, there is a different protocol, and that does not require parental agreement. So our next thing is about MET, and this stands for the Multidisciplinary Evaluation Team. This is responsible for evaluating students that may qualify for special education services. The team is made up of people who specialize in different areas, so often there'll be a school psychologist, special ed teacher, a gen ed teacher, an administrator, and additional service providers such as occupational therapists or speech therapists if necessary. Our next thing is REED, so READ, and that stands for the Review of Existing Evaluation Data. So this data is used by the IEP team before their initial evaluation of a student, then again when they reevaluate a student, as well as if they think a student should end special education services. A READ requires parental consent when it is used for an initial evaluation. So the IEPT stands for the Individualized Education Program Team. So this is the group that will create the student's IEP, which includes the parent, gen ed teacher, special ed teacher, a school district representative, school psych, and potentially the student as well, depending on their age. Once they are 16, they will have to be a part of their IEP process. So this is the differences between the initial IEP and transition IEP. So the initial IEP is the first time a student is considered for special ed services. They are evaluated first to decide if they meet the criteria necessary to qualify. And once they are evaluated and if it is decided that they would benefit from those services, then the IEP would be drafted. The goal of that IEP is to allow a student to progress forward each school year and determine what services are necessary to do so. So the difference between that and the transition IEP is that the transition IEP is necessary once the student is 16 years old. So that IEP outlines how the student will be able to become independent and what their plans are after they have completed high school. So an annual review IEP is the IEP that comes after the initial one. So the IEP must be reviewed every 365 days. During the review, the team must determine if the student is making progress towards their goals and how the student has progressed. That IEP will be redrafted to include new goals for the student as well as any changes that will need to be made. If there are more accommodations that need to be added or if the student no longer needs a certain accommodation. And then a re-evaluation IEP, that can be done if there are conditions that make one necessary, so if the student performance is increased or if the parent requests it. The process continues in the same way as it does with an annual IEP, and the student's previous evaluations are reviewed and then they are re-evaluated. And then manifestation determination, that occurs when a student with an IEP is maybe suspended or expelled due to a behavioral issue. This process determines whether the behaviors are related to the student's disability or not, and the team meets to go over the information to try to determine that. And then a due process hearing is protected by IDEA, and this only happens after a decision cannot be made by mediation. The school district and parent of the student with the IEP present their evidence in front of a hearing officer, and if the decision still does not seem fair to the parent, it can be appealed all the way to the federal level. So this is if something needs to be added. It's called an addendum to the progress IEP. So if there need to be used to make minor changes to an IEP while the year is in effect, a progress report must occur as often as the gen ed students, so often it occurs twice